Hi, this is Jim Hennager. Table talk for New Independent Party. It's December 28th. He just gave you a quick update on the weather outside. The lake is pretty well frozen. We've had upwards to 10 inches of snow here in the last couple days. So the weather changed pretty fast. And I think the geese have finally taken off. I don't see any now for a couple days. So that's the state of weather here in Iowa right now. Looks like winter's set in. Today I'd like to get into another area that I think is terribly important for the future of where we're going to head. And this is one of the toughest ones to change. I mean, they're all tough. Everything I brought up is tough to change. And I'm sure you're appreciating by now that I see one of the biggest problems with how we run our government is to allow special interest groups to have so much power. They have power by the amount of money they give in campaigns, but they also have power in being allowed to write legislation. They're involved in many of the committees on all of the agencies and departments, and that intermingling of special interest people into the business of government, in my opinion, and a lot of people would support this, that the corporate interest have found a way to use the government as a profit center. They're benefiting directly from decisions made by government, and it's always to their favor. And in many cases, they're protected when other people might be arrested and put in prison for felony crimes. A lot of these people have been able to be protected. And there's none more clear in that situation than in the banking industry, which is where we're going to go today. I think we have to do some pushback as citizens of the United States to make some corrections in an over excess of the power that's being given to the big banks in the United States. And this isn't something new. Something that my students have found amazing is that the Federal Reserve in the United States is not actually a government entity. The chairman of the Federal Reserve is appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, but that's where it stops. None of their buildings, we don't give them any money for salaries or any support. They have their own budget. It's never been audited. And it all began back in 1913 when the United States, to be honest, was in financial trouble. It appeared that we weren't going to be able to even make the payroll in January. A number of the bankers and vice president at that time were involved in secret meetings on an island off of the Carolinas, and they waited till all the senators had gone home for Christmas recess, and they held a secret meeting late at night. I think it was maybe December 10th or December 13th, something like that. And so just a few people from the banking committee and senators from the banking committee and the vice president passed what became known as the Federal Reserve Act. And after the recess, senators came back and discovered that they voted for it, didn't even know about it. And I'm sure there was, something in their Christmas stocking for going along with it, as you can imagine. So in exchange for helping out the government with $43 million, which was a lot of money in 1913, we were in a recession, the government was broke, but instead of borrowing the money from these banks, they traded their soul. That's how I look at it. They gave them a franchise to be the central bank of the United States. And in that, they gave them some powers. One was to control the money supply, and they do that by several means. One, they can print money. They don't really print the money. What they do is give themselves credit. It's a paper transaction. You see it on TV all the time. When somebody talks about the Federal Reserve, you see these printing presses around. Well, that's not what happens. They simply expand the money supply by giving themselves credit in those big banks. So they can increase the money supply. They can also decrease it by raising the interest rate, prime interest rate. They can also tighten it up by requiring all banks to have more money set aside in their reserve. So those are the instruments that the Federal Reserve can use to control the money supply. And they also have regulatory kinds of powers where they're supposed to keep track of the money supply and what's happening in banks. They can set regulations on both the state and federal banks, national banks, and they oversee the administrative part of all of that. So, they do some good things. There's no way to deny that they have kept, some organization to our banking system, which is one of the largest in the world. On the other hand, the way it came together, there was about 13 banks involved, of which about 75% of that 4,300 came from about 5 banks in the New York area. And so they divided up the nation into regional banks, sections, and the New York branch is obviously the most powerful. In 1913, it was banks like the Chemical Bank, the Citibank, the Chase Bank, Chase Manhattan Bank, the Morgan Bank. Those were the big banks at that time. And so you can say that, for all practical purposes, these banks bought the franchise to be the central bank of the United States. But they also have control over it in several other ways. For example, the Federal Reserve picks up most of its directors, both in the regional Federal Reserves and in the central one, through what they have are a number of committees. And these regional directors of the banks, who are also bankers in the private sector, are the people that make up those committees. So a lot of the Federal Reserve policies depend on who's on what committee, and it changes because people resign and retire and all of those kind of things. So it's not like one person controls the Federal Reserve. It's a group of bankers, private bankers, on these committees, and what policies they want to push it at any given time. So one way they control it is by just having their presence. I mean, they are in these committees, they're on these regional banks boards, and they then move from their banks to the Federal Reserve, and then they move over to the U.S. Treasury, and it's sort of like revolving doors. They just keep moving around key personnel from one sector to the other, and that keeps basically all of the policies and all of the philosophies pretty close to those large banks. So you can see that very few banks have tremendous control over our central banking system, and most of the public doesn't even realize this. I've only had 1 or 2 students in 40 years that even knew this. More are getting to understand that now, and I'm mentioning it because I think the U.S. public needs to know, how these things work. And you don't have to agree with me, and I'm certainly, there are people who are going to disagree with it, but that's how it looks to me. Well, what they've done over the years, and I brought this up when we talked about the agriculture, they deliberately raised the interest rates, the prime interest rates, to shut down credit, and it affected, businesses and farms and mortgages in 1978 dramatically. But they also have a way of working together between the big banks and the Federal Reserve to set international monetary strategies. And none can be more evident than their involvement in the NAFTA, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, which was actually put together by a member of that Big Five, Goldman Sachs, a principal from Goldman Sachs, pretty much hand wrote the thousands of pages of NAFTA and then presented it to Congress, and on fast track they passed it without ever really seeing the legislation. I was involved with Ross Perot at that time. I called all of the Iowa House members and the senators. Not one of them had seen that legislation, but they all told me they were going to pass it, vote for it, on the recommendations of their party's leadership. So it was both the Republicans and Democrats that were involved in that decision to pass NAFTA. And of course, if you were around then, you would have heard that Ross Perot was calling NAFTA, a big sucking sound from Mexico, that all the jobs would go south, which actually turned out to be pretty close to the truth. But when I called them, it was obvious that they're going to pass that, and that passed in October of '94. So you followed me on these dates if I can bring them out. So we had that passed just before the election, and there was some consternation in the public press about NAFTA, but it got passed without too much flack from the public. And then we went into a national election, and it never came up what that implication was in November. But in Mexico, they had a national election in December, and it never became an issue there either, although there were tremendous things going on in the background that go back to the summer of '93. The prime rate had been, maybe 3.5%, and in the spring of '93, Federal Reserve lowered their prime rate down to like 1.5%, and as a result, basically the big banks, now they were the Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, the Bank of America, and Wells Fargo. These banks were able to basically draw down almost $360 billion, and they then loaned it, which is all orchestrated, to about 4,000 companies in Mexico. And these companies were connected to supplying, a chain of companies here in the United States, like tire companies, carburetor companies, companies that made metal screws and fabricated seats and all those kinds of related industries. They loaned this $360 billion to 4,000 companies in Mexico at very high rates of interest. They started at 25%, and some of them went up to 75%. So the companies took the money, but also in that package deal were about 30 national companies from Mexico, a telephone company, transportation companies, railroad companies, some banks, 30 of these national companies that were owned by the state of Mexico were basically loaned money at the same time, and then the directors of each of these institutions was given $1 billion each to go along with it. So as this is unfolded, these 4,000 companies then came to a time when that interest was due, which would have been between December of '94 and January of '95, and they couldn't pay the interest. So, and that was already known, but that wasn't told to the public in Mexico or the United States. And so all these companies defaulted at about the same time, and the banks and the companies behind these loans in the United States basically bought all these companies for 10 cents on the dollar. and an automaker here in the United States was one of the principals involved in this. they then acquired, tire companies and carburetor companies and all these companies, and eventually moved a lot of the plants, automaking manufacturing plants, down to Mexico. So you can check it out and find out for yourself who these are. But that's one of the reasons why this car maker has been able to be so profitable and didn't have any kind of problem in 2008 when some of the other car manufacturers were actually bankrupt. So, from their point of view, a business strategy, it was a very good strategy. It cut down their cost, like labor. Maybe the average Mexican labor was getting $8 a day, and then all of a sudden, in this restructuring, the peso collapsed in January of '95, and now they were getting maybe $5 a day. So the labor was helped. They then owned all the supply sources, and they came out very well. In fact, the Goldman Sachs had about 180 billion of that 360, and here was the principal, one of their owners, who had written the legislation for it. So you can see that how revolving doors work on this kind of strategy. So then they now owned 4,000 companies in Mexico, and 30 of the top nationalized companies there in Mexico. And what we saw right away was companies starting to move from the United States down to Mexico because of the cheap labor. Here in Iowa, we lost over 400 companies alone to move to Mexico. And we also saw that labor unions immediately were affected because, like a tire company in Des Moines, was sold to a Japanese company, and they took it right away in labor negotiations and said, we're either going to move our plant, this plant in Des Moines, to Mexico, or you're going to have to take less in wages. So the average wage had been about $18 per hour. Eventually, over the next few years, it's now down around $12. So this whole strategy benefited major companies, not just in the United States, but also other companies on the international level as well. But you can see how by the Federal Reserve changing interest rates, producing money, loaning it, if the big banks were borrowing at 1.5%, 2%, and they were loaning it out through companies, basically bonds, for 25 to 75%, they were making a lot of money on this deal. Plus, they were able to take control of these companies. So I've always been very cautious. I have to agree with Ross Perot here that these free trade agreements, and that was just the first one. In the late 90s, we saw another one develop in the Japan banking system, which had the very same structure to it. It was, again, low interest rates. They bailed them out, and then they yanked the chain and bought them out. And so you saw it again. Then you saw it in the Caribbean, the same kind of free trade agreement there. Just this last October, November, a free trade agreement was initiated in Southeast Asia, some 18, 19 countries involved in that. And again, we weren't given, privy to all of the companies involved, but it was the same kind of restructuring, refinancing, taking over of companies and banks in every place they go. And now they're working on something similar to an effort just like it in Africa. Now that raises some interesting, connect the dots here. The president of Libya, Omar Gaddafi, was actually trying to organize through the Organization of African States a strategy so that they could be, sort of like the United States and function as a whole continent, basically, in marketing, trading, and finance. And so here, the United States, Britain come in and basically destroy the whole country. And you have to wonder exactly what was behind this. So it would appear that there was, secondary reasons or hidden agendas going on in not only destroying Libya, but also destroying that effort for the organization of Africa. And then we have the same kind of situation in an organization of countries in South America and Latin America, and it doesn't take too many guesses as to why some of these countries are very, defensive, very paranoid about getting involved with the United States in these issues, and why countries, show favor to us for a while and then, turn against us. There's some obvious reasons why you need to be careful about how these things develop and them out of control. Now, you hear it as a conspiracy theory that what's really going on are a very few small groups of special interest bankers, wealthy people, big companies that are involved in secret organizations. You hear names like Bilderberg and Council of Foreign Affairs and the Trilateral Commission and the Alpha Group, and there's a number of these societies, and I think they're all real, and some of them involve bankers and industrialists. So it's very possible that these people are trying to control the financial rhythm, so to speak, on the international level as well as within their own country. Now you have to ask yourself, and if you had $100 million in your pocket or in your bank account, you might also be one of these people that try to control it and make the most money. Banking is obviously one of those areas where zero-sum strategy, zero-sum gaming is dominant. And I'm going to argue that as long as we have that, as long as we allow that, we're never going to be able to balance our economy, maintain any kind of equilibrium on an economic basis. Unemployment's going to go up and down, interest rates are going to go up and down, stocks and bonds are going to go up and down, because that's part of their game. That's part of the zero sum. They win, we lose. And you can't see it any more evident than in the stock market, because the bigger players can push the price up, but they can also drop it and sell short ahead of time. And the average investor, the day traders, and the people that have 5,000 or 10,000 in it, they're just going to lose their money almost every time. So you really have the wealthiest people taking advantage of the smaller investors, and we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. So they win no matter what happens, and everybody else loses. That's zero sum, okay? So what I'm suggesting is we have to move in new directions. And it's surprising that these large banks, well, it's not really surprising, because their people are in the U.S. Treasury Department, their people are in the Justice Department. So these big banks have committed all kinds of federal felony crimes, fraud and money laundering, all these kinds of crimes, and they get fined from time to time. But as far as I know, nobody's ever gone to jail. And I think we have to bring in a new party, new independent party, and set some different standards. And the Department of Justice and the banking industry needs to be regulated in a way that's more non-zero sum, that's going to benefit all the people and not just a small group of people. And I think it would start with deep audits in these large banks and the Federal Reserve, which are not happening. Now the big banks get audited, and there's been some litmus tests given to them as far as their being solvent. But actually it doesn't get into what I'm calling a deep audit, which would get into literally hundreds of trillions of dollars of derivatives that they've issued, and they're not on the books. So if all of those derivatives came forward and they were negative, I would think most of those large banks would be insolvent. And I think the Federal Reserve is insolvent. I don't know how it can't be with the kind of economic easing, trillions of dollars being issued here in the last 10 years of new money, and they have bonds behind that. So I think it would be very critical to have deep audits of all of those, and then we'd have to decide where we'd go from that. But it would certainly look like the one option is to divest those big banks. And there's a number of reasons why that makes sense. When 2008 happened and the recession and all of the economic easing came out of that, which again, it was very suspicious how they could have all that legislation ready in a matter of weeks. And nobody, really read it ahead of time. And all of a sudden, they're giving out, 30 billion here and 60 billion here and 70 billion here. But all of that money went to these big banks. It didn't go to the mortgage holder or the homeowner or even to any small banks for the most part. It really stayed within the larger big banks. And those banks actually make interest off of that easing. There's an agreement in the Federal Reserve that they get, a percentage of that interest. So here you have banks and the Federal Reserve who have no incentive to keep down the national debt. I mean, they all benefit from having it go up, even if it's paper money. I think the federal debt's paying interest of $350 billion a year, and that money goes to somebody. And those big banks are some of that, where that money goes. So there's no incentive in this structure for, them to put any pressure on the U.S. government to keep costs down. In fact, it's just the opposite. They're willing to allow it to, they keep giving credit, so the debt keeps going up. That has to stop. We have to find a level where the government runs on a balanced budget, and I'm a very strong advocate of that. I know many people are. It just makes sense. And once that is set up and we can get to a strategy where we have 18% of gross national product coming in as revenue to the federal government, and we get the cost down to 15%, then we can promise that 3% difference there to pay off the national debt. And I'm an advocate, particularly if we find out the Federal Reserve is insolvent, that we issue a silver certificate by the U.S. Treasury and paper-wise pay off the whole national debt and stop paying interest on it. They're not going to want to do that. I think a new party coming in could demand that, and I think that makes sense. And then we wouldn't be paying that 350 to 400 billion a year in interest, and we would have a chance through this 3% each year to pay down. You'd have to pay that off. You just can't write it off, I don't believe. So that's a strategy to pay off our debt, and I don't know of any others that's out there. But there's some other things that need to happen as we get into restructuring how our banks work, and this would involve setting up what I would call regional government centers. I think we're going to have to move government in from Washington, D.C. for a number of reasons, environmental as well as political and security, and maybe have 6 regional banks as well as 6 regional government centers in the United States, all inside the Appalachian and the Rocky Mountains. And these 6 national banks then would be not owned by the banks, they would be owned by the U.S. Treasury. And then there would be a network of banks below them, which could be, we have First National banks and those kinds of structures which are privately owned, but you could also have the states then develop basically state-owned banks, similar to what North Dakota has, and they've done very well in the last 10 or 20 years, that all of the revenues come into their state bank, and they don't pay, another commercial bank for those services, and they then earn interest on that money as it floats through their bank, and they're able to give out economic development loans to people with that excess money. So it just makes sense to have 6 national banks and then a network out of there of state banks, and then below that would be the commercial banks. I'm not opposed to having commercial banks, but I think they need to fall within that kind of structure. And another thing that would need to kind of be looked at or changed is what we have now is some legislation in the Frank Dodd bill that was passed here after 2008. Its intentions, at least publicly, the intentions were to make the banks safer, and they're requiring the solvency test on banks. But they've added so much compliance to banking procedures that small banks and community banks just do not have the expertise and the people in them to handle the thousands and thousands of pages of compliance that they have to. So in the last few years, I think we've seen 1,300 community banks, small banks, disappear because they can't afford that kind of compliance rendering, basically. And it's the large banks, the Wells Fargo and the Bank of America, that are able to handle those. And now, for a couple of years, the only banks in Iowa that have been doing, mortgage lending are those big banks. So that's not really fair. I think we have to change that so that small banks can operate profitably and not have quite as much, compliance requirements on them, but still keep it in a safe range. I don't think you have to give away the farm to allow small banks to operate. But I see a need for community banks and credit unions. I think the banks in local communities being basically owned by the people in those communities, like in a credit union, a nonprofit basis where you have, maybe 1,000, 5,000 people in your community all put money into a bank, that makes a lot of sense to me. So you have community banks, you have credit unions that can basically take care of the day-to-day banking needs, and then you have larger banks in a state, and you have a state bank and then a national banks, and out of that system you elect representatives, some from the banking community and some from the public, in my suggestion, and that forms your central bank. And I think that would operate very, very well here in the United States, and it's designed to help everybody. It's not designed to help just a few banks. Since 2008, those top 5 banks, by getting that easing money that was given out, they were able to buy up the next 100 largest banks. So that's how they grew, and it was very deliberate. This was all pre-planned. I think it was scenarioized out, orchestrated from the beginning. So here you have a president coming on in February saying, wow, we just got blindsided, nobody knew this was coming. That's bullwinkle. I think a lot of people knew what was happening, and the banks were giving $40-50 million to political candidates, including the president. So this whole thing was, behind the scenes orchestrated, and it was to benefit a few banks and not the public. I think we got to reverse that. It doesn't have to go completely the other way. I think you can have, a fair balance of big banks and small banks, but I don't think it's true that some banks are too big to fail or too big to, have the Justice Department go in and arrest them and put them in prison if they're doing, money laundering or other kinds of fraud. And what happened to people all over the world was obviously fraud when you had these derivatives being sold all over the world by these principal banks, and there wasn't anything behind them that was legitimate. And that's where they're insolvent. I mean, if they have 100 trillion in these derivatives out there, and it was based on maybe having several million homes and mortgages and packages, and normally the value of homes goes up, but in 2008, because of that bubble popping, the value of those homes went down. So they're carrying it on the books as though it's $3 to $4 trillion, but the actual value of those homes in many cases might be half that. So they really have a loss of trillions of dollars, and they're carrying it on the books, invisible to the public. Are you following that? It's complicated, and I'm trying to simplify it, but that's where these big banks are, pulling the wool over the eyes of a lot of people in government as well as the public. So I think there's a couple things in the Thank Dodd bill that were attempts to stop some of this corruption. For example, this goes all the way back. I mentioned that there was a principal from Goldman Sachs that put together NAFTA. Well, then he later became Secretary of Treasury of the United States under the Clinton administration. He pushed very hard to change the interest rates on consumer loans, and so we saw consumer loans develop in the 90s go from like, a limit of $150 to 300 to, 1,000 to, now some of those credit cards are $15, $20, $30,000. And that was all a result of the same individual and that movement in government. That also applied to small business loans, and what it did was expand the credit by trillions and trillions of dollars. So we often give credit to the Clinton administration for some very favorable economic times, but it was all based on credit. And you can't base growth in your economy, GDP, entirely on credit. Somebody has to pay that credit off. And what happened was, by the time we got to 2005, 2006, 2007, we had a credit situation where on the consumer side, they were 104% of their ability to pay it back. They were over their ability. We had people, taking this credit card and paying the monthly payment on this one. I know an individual that has 10 credit cards, and he bought a home with all those 10, and it was a very low interest rate, but he has to keep making those payments every month, or it just automatically goes from like 3 or 4 or 7% up to, maybe 18%. And he'd lose his house. We got into some practices both as consumers and small businesses and banks where we got addicted to credit. And I see the same thing happening in China today and in Europe, and that's dangerous. Real economic growth comes from companies expanding, products expanding, sales expanding. It doesn't happen because you double, triple, quadruple your credit in an economy. So by the time we got to 2008, that bubble was ready to pop. Not only there was 104% ability to pay it back, but the savings rate had gone negative. People weren't able to save any money, and because of the low interest rate by the Federal Reserve, banks didn't have any incentive to offer savings interest, interest on your savings account. So people had no incentive to save at all. They just kept using it to borrow more money on their credit cards. So we got into a very dangerous cycle, and that's been corrected somewhat, and I've talked about this a little bit. The savings rate is up, and the credit card payments have come down, been paid down, but it's not being paid by the average American. What's happened are people that are in the upper middle class, the people that have some discretionary money at the end of the month, they were able to pay theirs down, and they were able to put some into savings. So it looks like the saving rate has gone up. But most of the average Americans are still going paycheck to paycheck. They have no savings, they have no retirement, and it's a pretty dire situation for most people if the economy would collapse again, because I don't think that we're going to be able to have these big banks or the Federal Reserve go out and do the easing, the printing of the money again, for a number of reasons, which I'm probably not going to get into that, but it has to do with the United States having the label, at least, of being an international Federal Reserve, an international reserve currency. And, there's 4 or 5 other countries that have that, and now China has it as well. So there's more competition out there for international trading of money, currencies, and a lot of people are moving their currencies away from the U.S. dollar. A lot of wire transfers are moving to other ways of doing it, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that other countries no longer felt like the U.S. dollar was viable when it came to buying these bonds behind the easing. And in some cases, they would offer, they'd have their meeting to sell these international bonds, and nobody would show up. So they got into some spurious kinds of situations where Belgium bought a bunch of them, and they didn't have the money in their banks to cover the buying of the bonds. So here the Federal Reserve was giving them a credit to buy bonds from the Federal Reserve. Crazy kind of stuff. It's just like my friend using his credit cards to pay off other credit cards. So that's going to stop someplace, and I think it already has. I just don't think that free-flowing of money is going to happen anymore. And here we raised the credit limit again. I think we're up to 18 trillion. So we're right up to the top of what can happen in the banking system. So either it's going to collapse, or we have to move in some new directions. And so I'm suggesting that we need to take these very important steps to bring the banks into some kind of structure that benefits everybody, not just the banks. And some of the ways that can be done, like in credit unions, the new independent credit unions are being organized, and we'd like to see them in as many communities as people would like to develop them. But here you'd have a situation where all the people would control, each one would have one vote in that credit union. If there was excess, money left over at the end of the year, that would be divided out as profit sharing basically to their members. I like that, that's non-zero sum. Everybody is winning, everybody is gaining from that kind of activity. But also, I see these new credit unions, one, I think they can have gold as a reserve, part of their reserve requirement. So it's backed by gold. I don't know of any bank or credit union or community bank in the United States that's backed by gold. There's a lot of gold out there that could be bought and put it into the reserve. It tightens up the limits of what can be loaned out, but that's a way to do it. I think people would feel more comfortable if there was actual gold behind the money that they put into one of these credit unions. Another thing I think that could be done is that I think these new credit unions could offer savings that vary from 4% to 6%. And you ask, how can that be possible when the other banks aren't offering anything? Well, just do it. So you have your interest rate starts at 4% of anything that's there over 30 days, and then if your money's in there over 180 days, it goes up to 6%. At the same time, these credit unions can then start turning that money, which is not happening today. They can offer that to local business for expansion. They can offer it for new businesses starting up, and that would get money turning in the local community, and that's not happening. I mean, the big banks aren't interested in small loans. They're not interested in small. In fact, I've just read where the Bank of America has asked towns, cities, to go find another bank. They don't want to deal with them. A year ago, they changed their policy on their business requirements. To have a business account, you have to have a minimum of $3,000 in the account at all times. So literally hundreds of thousands of people were kicked out of that banking system because they're raising the requirements of who they want to deal with. And it certainly looks like the Frank Dodd bill, even if it wasn't their intention, has moved to get rid of competition. The smaller banks, the mid-sized banks are being hurt badly, and we're going to only end up with some big banks who are only interested in their own profit, in my opinion, which is exactly what happened in '78, and the Federal Reserve was behind that too. So I think consolidation and merging and all of that is connected to this kind of economic zero-sum strategies, and it has to be pushed back. I mean, the new independent party has to push back and say, we're not going to do this anymore. It's got to be balanced out more than it is. And so I think by offering savings and then offering loans in the local community, you could have car loans again for 8%. You could have mortgages for 7.5%, 8%, which we always had. Canada still has those kind of rates. Most of the world has those kind of rates. Having the Federal Reserve stay so low has actually hurt our economy. That's people wonder how you can say that, but it really has. It's stopped the flow of money, and the small banks have been hurt because of it, because they can attract savings into their banks. But I think by offering 4% to 6% and having a gold reserve, but I also think that these credit unions can offer their services without any charges. I think more than 50% of the income revenues are being made by these larger banks today by the services fees that they're charging, the bank overdrafts and the monthly fees and those kind of things, because they're not counting on turning the money. The difference between what you give in savings and what you put out your loans at. That's usually the operating expense of a bank, but it isn't today. They're making money off of your service fees, and they're depending on people that have small amounts in their accounts getting charged for these extra fees. I've known students that it's a general practice that they might have 4 or 5 checks that are written at the same time, and one of them is larger than the others, and the bank will run through the largest one first so they can charge $35 or $50 a piece for all the others. Well, that happens a couple times and you can't afford a banking account. There are over 40 million people in the United States can't afford a banking account. And I think that's critical to where we want to go. We want to have everybody with a bank account. We want to have an ID that's related to that, because we want all of that, tax structure to change so that 15% on the federal level of your income is going to go into an account and automatically go to the federal government, automatically go to the state government, and then there's going to be sub-accounts under that, with one going to your retirement. It's sort of like a 401k, but it's an individual retirement account, another one going to individual medical account, and then you can start structuring it so that instead of requiring everybody to have health insurance, it makes more sense to have a requirement that all employers have to contribute 5% of the wages into this individual medical account. Instead of having it go to insurance and insurance companies make money, or the providers make money, medical providers make money, I think that individual retirement account, individual medical account should be the individual's money. And if there's an emergency, there should be provisions for them to borrow it to buy a house or pay for an education or something. But we could also have an account in there that's for individual education account. And we could have an account in there for your other kinds of benefits, like life insurance and retirement insurance and those kinds of things. So your money comes in electronically. It just divides out into these sub-accounts, 4 or 5 of them. You'd have one to pay all your monthly bills if they were the same each month. Like your utility bills could be all paid, your mortgage or your rent could be paid, and your insurance could all be paid. You'd have all of those. And then you have a discretionary one that's tied to a debit card. And if there was $3,000 came in and all of these things sorted out, and you had $700 left over, then your debit card would be worth $700. And if you didn't have any money left over, your debit card would not have any. It needs to be a smart debit card, so that you're not going to go and run it through a machine at the box store and have an overdraft. No more overdrafts. You either have the money in there or you don't. And the banks now could get into financial advising. They could have educational programs. They could have sit-down meetings where they work with their bank customers, their credit union customers, so that everybody knows how this banking works, and you don't have people that spend more money than they have money for. I know a young high school student who opened up an account. In the very first month, he had like 7 overdrafts. Nobody taught him how to do banking, and that's what we have to do. We have to go into school systems and college, and giving credit cards to college students is stupid. That's just asking for problems. So we have to get it organized to be more non-zero sum, everybody benefits. And these credit unions could do that on a local community. They're not going to do it on the state level or the national level, but in the communities they could be a very strong force for turning credit, turning money, and getting more and more jobs created in these local small communities. So I would argue that there are new directions that we could go. And the New Independent Party is trying to organize credit unions as many states and many towns as we can. We also have an online education program called the New Independent Learning Centers, where we would have courses that we could offer for free to these bank customers, credit union customers, where they could take an online class so that everybody knows that they should know, how you do banking, how you handle credit, which is not happening. We just have to have more awareness, more knowledge, more people involved. But we have to change the politics at the top, and that goes to the federal government. That's not going to happen as long as these special interest groups have control of our government. And, if the general population, the citizens of the United States, aren't willing to stand up and change the direction of this by putting in a new party, nothing's going to happen. It's only going to get worse. And the next time that we have a crash, it's going to be maybe 5 times or 100 times worse than the last. Our banking system is a house of cards today. It could go down, and it could wipe out everybody's retirement, almost everybody's. We wouldn't even have banks to handle day-to-day kinds of operations. So I think it's a critical issue. I think there's solutions to it, and I recommend that we move in new directions. I think we can do better. Okay? Thank you.